The young girl heard a constant buzzing sound in her ears. A white light completely obscured her vision. In every muscle, every limb, every corner of her body she felt a burning sensation, a pain that hindered her movements. The 17-year-old girl was convinced that she was dead and that life after death was similar to a state of deep sleep. She could still see images of what had happened moments ago. She could vividly visualize the moment when her mother was mercilessly thrown into the sky by the dragon. There was a sort of loop in her mind reminding her of the traumatic incident. Every time she remembered being decapitated by a monster, her stomach dropped with fear. And suddenly, just when she thought she would never see the world around her again, she felt a slight discomfort in her chest. It rose and fell very slowly, accompanied by a pain in her ribs when she took a deep breath. She was breathing, and that's when she knew she wasn't dead yet, but rather very weak and physically exhausted. The girl was lying on green grass that pricked her skin, and the sun beat down on her face so forcefully that her skin, which was always very pale, turned reddish. She didn't really know what was happening around her. She only heard birds singing and the breeze rustling through her black hair. There was not a single sound of cars speeding by, or the ringing of a bicycle bell, not even the giggles of teenagers waiting for the school bus. The tears that had streamed down her face were now completely dried. The wounds on her cheeks were no longer bleeding, but they still hurt. The tears had left stains and a thin, long line that showed the path the blood had taken before drying up. The rain had also plastered some strands of black hair to her forehead. Scarlet didn't know what to do to get up from the ground. Her muscles hurt and stung so much that she couldn't move an arm even an inch, and for some strange reason, despite having her mouth open, she couldn't produce any sound, not even a soft moan. "The student says he saw him at the top of the mountain," a female voice suddenly said in the distance. Scarlet heard the voice and strained her ears as much as possible. She wanted to signal her presence by making some sound, but her vocal cords continued to fail her. It was as if she were in a nightmare, being chased by a killer, and she couldn't call for help because her voice had vanished and everything was moving in slow motion. Some footsteps were heard, followed by murmurs of several people talking at once. The dark-haired girl could feel the steps of several people approaching her. She knew she was going to be rescued. A man's gasp was heard, as if he had seen the ghost of a loved one or found a lifeless body.
"There she is!"
exclaimed the deep male voice. The footsteps quickened, and Scarlet could hear them approaching closer and closer to her. She felt relief inside that she had finally been found and would be safe. As they reached her, she felt the gentle touch of a hand on her wrist, searching for a heartbeat. The unknown man sighed in relief upon feeling a weak pulse in her veins and withdrew his hand from the teenage girl who still couldn't open her eyes to see what was happening around her.
"She's still alive, thank goodness,"
said the male voice, sighing. Another hand brushed the strands of hair stuck to her forehead. Suddenly, she heard another gasp. "Wait! Is it just me, or does this girl look a lot like Fawny?" a female voice pointed out. "No, that's impossible," another voice replied. "Maliz Fern is going to be thrilled to hear about Fawny Waster's daughter's death," echoed the voice of the red-haired woman who had nearly decapitated her. The mention of this Fawny Waster resonated in Scarlet's mind. Slowly, Scarlet began to open her eyes, which were filled with crusts that hurt as she opened them. Her muscles still burned, but this time she was able to move them with slow and painful movements. The shining sun backlit the faces of the people around her. She placed a hand over her cheeks. Her tears were dry, but the wounds still hurt. Scarlet grunted as she tried to get up. "She's awake," exclaimed the female voice once again.
"Who the hell are you?"
a male voice demanded to know. Using all her strength in her arms, Scarlet managed to sit upright. Her entire body ached, completely covered in bruises and deep scratches that had healed. Her head was spinning, and she held it with her left hand, pressing her temples with her fingers. She took a deep breath. After a few seconds, she lifted her head to analyze her surroundings and, above all, the people who were watching her. She was curious because it didn't seem like she was in her backyard. She was lying on grass that was too green and filled with flowers of various colors. She opened her eyes fully, her vision blurry like an unfocused camera, and it cleared within a few seconds, revealing a scene that left her dumbfounded. There were 4 people surrounding her, each with a different expression and physical appearance. The first person she could analyze, who stood out the most, was a woman in her 40s. When she smiled, you could clearly see some wrinkles on her forehead and at the corners of her eyes. Her reddish hair was tied up in a high bun, but there were a few rebellious strands escaping on the sides. Her dark skin also had some black freckles on the tip of her nose and cheeks. She was crouched down, observing Scarlet with a worrying smile full of curiosity. The second person she had the chance to analyze was a brown-skinned man kneeling next to her. His dark and wavy hair covered his ears and reached the middle of his neck. His almond-shaped eyes seemed threatening, as if he was ready for Scarlet to attack him. He had a well-defined nose and pink lips. A 3-day dark beard covered most of his chin. The third person was another woman standing farther away from the others. She was dressed in a dark blue cloak that fit her body, accentuating her curves. Her arms were crossed over her chest, and her intense gaze was intimidating. Scarlet noticed her shiny, extremely long white hair that fell down to her lower back. But what stood out the most about this woman was her cheek, which seemed to have a tattoo in the shape of the letter L in dark purple. The fourth person surrounding her was an elderly man. His white hair with defined curls made Scarlet envious, as she had always wanted curls in her own hair. He was dressed in a purple cloak adorned with strange scribbles, similar to the one worn by the woman with the tattoo. His eyes were a deep blue, like a water lily, filled with curiosity and wisdom. His wrinkled and aged skin was just a mask that concealed his energy and zest for life. Scarlet blinked twice, unable to react to the scene before her. What? Where? Scarlet stammered, completely disoriented. They immediately knew she wasn't Fonny Waster upon hearing her voice. Moreover, there were some facial differences such as her flat eyebrows, gray eyes, black hair, and her round, youthful face that resembled her. It's not her. What is a non-wizard doing in the middle of the hill? Spoke the blonde woman, her voice filled with anger and coldness. She approached Scarlet, her eyes reflecting deep hatred, seemingly intent on causing harm. Scarlet tried to protect herself from a possible punch by covering her face with her arms. However, the red-haired woman intervened, extending her arms protectively and defiantly facing the other woman. We don't know. Maybe she fled from the non-magical world. Or perhaps. I don't know. All I know is that she's not Fonny, defended the redhead woman. Scarlet didn't understand anything. She was completely lost and dumbfounded. She didn't know who Fonny was, where she was, or what she was doing in this strange place. She lay on the grass in a meadow in the middle of the mountain, not in her own garden. The last thing she remembered was losing consciousness in her own backyard, and somehow ending up in this lost mountain. However, despite her efforts, she couldn't remember anything. As the two women argued behind her, occasionally interrupted by the accompanying man who offered his opinion, the two girls ignored him and continued shouting. Scarlet took advantage of the situation to stand up, as her muscles allowed her to, and carefully surveyed her surroundings. She was definitely on top of a hill. In the distance, she could make out an ancient city protected by a massive stone wall. The prominent feature was a huge castle in the middle of the city, standing out due to its size compared to the other houses. It struck Scarlet as curious. In the human world, it was normal to see castles, especially in Europe. But that castle seemed too modern compared to others, and the city had no skyscrapers or tall buildings like in New York or Tokyo. The breeze gently rustled her black hair as her wide eyes filled with fear and curiosity. She was lost in the countryside with strangers arguing amongst themselves. Her heart beat rapidly, and she knew she had to find a way to leave and go back home. But I have no home, Scarlet thought, remembering that her house was completely destroyed.
Do you know where you are?
Asked the elderly man, who had suddenly appeared by her side, observing the city alongside her. Scarlet was startled for a moment, frightened by the sudden appearance of the old man beside her. After calming down, she replied, "No. I don't." The man smiled, realizing Scarlet was so confused, so innocent, just like he was when he first arrived in this world. He saw himself reflected in her.
You are in Zai.
The old man answered. Scarlet had never heard a name like that in her life. She knew most of the cities and capitals of the world, she had studied them in geography class. But she had never heard of a city called Zai. She had so many questions to ask that she didn't know where to start. And where is Zai? What country is this? How did I get here? She began to ask.
Zai is not a town, it's not a country. It's a world.
The old man explained. A world? Scarlet raised an eyebrow at that statement. The man was old, he could be crazy, but he seemed so sure of his words that she couldn't help but listen more attentively. Besides, she was fascinated by the sights around her.
Earth was your world, wasn't it?
The old man continued. Earth was my world, the girl thought. So, you're saying I'm in another dimension? Scarlet asked, raising her eyebrow once more.
Technically, yes.
The old man confirmed. Scarlet wanted to laugh at him, but she also didn't want to come across as rude. Obviously, she wasn't going to believe those words so easily, it was completely surreal. How could other dimensions exist? And if they did, why would she be the first person to travel to a different dimension? Scarlet turned around, walking back towards the others, hoping to hear a more reasonable answer.
You don't believe me because I'm an old man.
The elderly man pointed out. She began to respond, but the old man interrupted her with a smile.
I know you don't believe my words, but deep down, you know that you're not in your world. You know you're in a different place, you know you're lost and don't know where to go.
He said. Scarlet took a step back. The arguments behind them seemed to have calmed down. The two women were no longer angry, just annoyed with each other. The man who had tried to break up the fight hurriedly approached Scarlet, placing a hand on her shoulder.
Are you from the non-wizard area?
He asked. Terrified, the young girl pushed him away. She felt like they were speaking a different language, she didn't understand anything they were talking about. Scarlet gasped for air, feeling like she was about to faint. What are you talking about? She shouted, holding herself. The 17-year-old girl stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own leg. The old man who had spoken to her earlier stepped in between them.
I think it's not just a simple non-wizard. It's something much more important.
The old man suggested. Everyone fell silent upon hearing that suggestion. Scarlet felt all eyes on her and shrunk down. The dark-skinned man turned his gaze toward the old man. You don't really mean, he started to say. The woman with white hair let out an exaggerated sigh, accompanied by a scoff. However, the woman beside her, the one with dark skin and red hair, brought a hand to her chin. Grandmaster, how long has it been since you visited the non-magical world? I know it doesn't seem like it, but, she suggested. For the star's sake, Daphne. She's a non-magical person. I highly doubt they've opened a portal as the Grandmaster implies, exclaimed the woman with white hair. A portal, thought Scarlet. But that's insane, such things don't exist. These people are crazy. The man approached Scarlet again and rested his hand on her shoulder. The girl with black hair looked into his eyes. This time they weren't as threatening. The unknown man had sensed her innocence and fear. He, too, knew that something strange was happening.
I know you have many questions, but right now we need answers. Do you know Fani?
He asked. Scarlet raised an eyebrow, looking into his eyes. She didn't know anyone named Fani. Fani? Scarlet stammered, trying to think. She doesn't know who that is, Dan. She's a non-magical person, the woman with white hair continued to complain. Dan, the man with dark hair, finally had a name. He turned around, giving a threatening look to the woman with white hair. The woman, with her nasal voice and cold gaze, fell silent, completely avoiding his gaze. She knew she had gone too far with her tone and aggressiveness.
It's clear she's a non-wizard. However, her resemblance to Fani is uncanny.
Dan muttered the last word, once again avoiding Scarlet's curious gaze. Scarlet felt a surge of bravery run through her body and mustered the courage to raise her voice loud enough for everyone to hear her clearly. Where the hell are we? I passed out in the middle of a storm and ended up in this strange place. And, no, I'm not a non-why? No whiz? She asked. The old man placed a hand on her shoulder, smiling from ear to ear as he realized his theory about Scarlet was true. The girl undoubtedly came from another world, as evidenced by her clothing and mentality. She was wearing her summer pajamas, a garment not sold in Zai.
I don't think she's a non-wizard, nor is she a magical one. Her clothing is strange,
the old man commented. The woman with red hair and dark skin placed her hand on her chin, fixing her gaze on the black-haired, acne-prone girl. It was true, her clothing was too peculiar even for non-wizards. Are you implying that a portal to the human world has been opened, Master? Dan asked. Even they think we're in another world. Thought Scarlet. You aren't humans, then? Scarlet asked. Dan glanced at the girl.
Are you implying that a portal to the human world has been opened, Master?
Dan was interrupted. The woman with white hair once again stepped between them, her nasal and shrill voice annoying Scarlet so much that she couldn't help but put on a displeased expression. You should know that we are far more cultured than mere humans. We're not like you, girl, the woman asserted. Dan, the man with dark hair, finally had a name. He turned around, giving a threatening look to the woman with white hair. The woman, with her nasal voice and cold gaze, fell silent, completely avoiding his gaze. She knew she had gone too far with her tone and aggressiveness. The woman with white hair didn't like Scarlet very much. She seemed upset by her mere presence and didn't trust her at all. It was like the other people at her school, who tried to stay away from Scarlet as much as possible and looked at her with disdain. Dan shook his head at his companion's attitude, running a hand over his face, trying to ignore the woman with pearly white hair.
Of course we are, but are you sure you don't know Fani? A girl with dark red hair, blue eyes, and a scar on her hand in the shape of an X,
he asked. With that last description, Scarlet could only think of her deceased mother. Tears welled up in her eyes again. She never thought she would cry over her mother's death, but there she was, with a heavy heart every time she thought of her. Her mother had dark hair, but her eyes were blue, and she had a scar on her left hand in the shape of an X. She told Scarlet when she was little that she got it while cutting an onion to make dinner. Scarlet always doubted that explanation, as the shape of the wound didn't correspond to a simple knife cut, and it seemed deep. But seeing that her mother wouldn't provide any further information, she didn't insist. Are you referring to my mother? The orphan asked, her voice trembling and breaking with each word. For a moment, there was no movement. Not a single voice, sound, or glance. Scarlet even thought they weren't breathing. Everyone remained silent, staring at the girl with wide eyes. Fani had a daughter? That's impossible. She can't have children with a human. Or can she? Murmured the woman with red hair, lost in her thoughts. The others looked at her with wide-open eyes, occasionally glancing at each other, trying to find an answer to their questions. They couldn't imagine Fani Waster having a daughter, let alone with a human. My mother's name is Olivia, Scarlet corrected them. The old man placed his hand on the girl's shoulder once again.
No, Olivia was the human name we gave to Fani so she could integrate herself into human society. It's clear that this girl is not Fani, but her daughter,
the old man said. The woman with white hair stared her with astonishment, almost as if her mere existence was something strange and fascinating. The others simply smiled, as if they were welcoming an old friend after decades. The woman with coppery hair approached Scarlet. I feel like we haven't formally introduced ourselves. I am Daphne, scholar of the School of Fire. Dan pushed Daphne aside.
I'm Daniel, scholar of the School of Earth.
The woman with white hair looked at Scarlet, doubting her, as if Scarlet were a wolf in sheep's clothing. She still seemed to despise her, but she didn't want to be rude and leave her intrigued. Aqua, scholar of the School of Water. They're teachers, Scarlet thought. Dan intervened once again.
Okay, I'm going to assume by your reaction that the worst has happened. Is your mother?
Dan tried to imply that Fani had passed away. Scarlet nodded, realizing what Dan was hinting at. Something killed her. It turned into an eagle, a dragon, and she couldn't continue. It felt like she was choking with every word she uttered, and her chest hurt as she remembered everything that had happened. Everyone watched her with concern, their eyes filled with disappointment upon hearing about Fani's death. Even the old man, who always seemed to be smiling, had lost his smile and the sparkle in his eyes. A shapeshifter, no doubt, Dan concluded, placing his index finger on his chin. They must have found her. Fani must have let her guard down, and Maliz sent his new allies after her. Scarlet ignored their explanation, having so many questions that she didn't know where to start. How did I get here? Where am I? Why am I here? What is this strange place? Why are you talking about portals? I don't. Scarlet asked, her heart pounding. Aqua squeezed the bridge of her nose, annoyed. Stop asking so many questions. Aqua snapped, overwhelmed. Scarlet immediately fell silent. Daphne shot an annoyed look at her sister Aqua but placed her hand on Scarlet's shoulder with a kind, loving, and tender gaze. What's your name, little one? Daphne asked. My name is Scarlet, she replied. Daphne nodded. Pleased to meet you. Has your mother ever tell you about Zai? About her origins? Daphne asked. Scarlet shook her head, sighing. Why would Fani tell her daughter about her origins when she didn't even share what was happening in her daily life? My mother hardly ever talked to me. Our relationship was non-existent, ma'am, the young girl explained. The other teachers glanced at each other, amazed. But Fani was so lovely with others, especially with children, Aqua commented, looking at the others for confirmation.
A shapeshifter, no doubt. I would doubt your explanation, but she clearly resembles her. Look at her face, they're like two peas in a pod,
Dan said. The old man approached the others with a serious expression. He reached behind Scarlet, gently pulling her collar down slightly. After inspecting, he noticed that there were no strange tattoos like the shapeshifter who destroyed their home. He looked up and shook his head.
She's not a shapeshifter, she's human,
he confirmed. The teachers let out relieved sighs, Daphne placed her hand on her chest, and Aqua, like her sister, had a look of relief on her pale face. It was evident that they were stressed, as if they were anticipating an unexpected attack at any moment. Scarlet, however, looked at them with astonishment and curiosity, as she hadn't fully processed the fact that she was in a completely different place from her home in that village.
I will take her to the tower and explain everything. She needs to know the truth, and we need a lot of information if we want to stop Maliz once and for all.
The old man informed them. Maliz. Scarlet remembered that name. The voice of her mother's killer echoed in her mind and refused to disappear. She remembered exactly how it was said, the cold tone of voice, the devilish gaze that longed to destroy her. When the shapeshifter tried to kill her, he mentioned the name Maliz Fern. That was the last thing Scarlet remembered about the attack before collapsing. Maliz Fern. Scarlet muttered. The teachers turned to look at her. They hadn't mentioned the surname of that Maliz, and Scarlet supposedly knew nothing about her mother's past. How on earth could she know the name of the most wanted man in Zai? Do you know him? Daphne exclaimed. I thought you didn't know anything about your mother's past. Scarlet recoiled at Daphne's tone of voice but defended herself. They tried to kill me in his name back at home, she explained, shouting. Who is that guy? Dan ignored that question and addressed the old man directly.
Master, are you sure? She appeared out of nowhere through a portal that we didn't open. Are you sure you want to tell the human everything?
Dan asked. The strange old man was called Master, which meant he was a very important person to them. The Master nodded without hesitation, gripping Scarlet's shoulder.
She's not entirely human. Her world is Zai, not the human world.
The Master said. Scarlet didn't see exactly what happened, but the others vanished in the blink of an eye. She was no longer in the meadow, feeling the breeze on her wounded skin, stepping on mud and grass. She found herself in a dark room with a high ceiling adorned with shelves filled with ancient books. The walls were dark, made of black, damp, and hard stone. The only source of illumination in that room was a lamp with fire. The girl looked up, and the ceilings were so high, illuminated by the light of a single torch hanging from the ceiling, swaying slowly from left to right. Despite the fact that it was a cold, dark place, and she was only wearing her summer pajamas, she wasn't shivering. What is all this? She muttered to herself. The Master suddenly held one of the fire lamps. Several books of different sizes and bindings were scattered across the floor. There were some papers sticking to the sole of her foot. Scarlet shook her foot, and they came right off.
Apologize, Scarlet. I'm not exactly an organized person,
the Master commented. I'm dreaming, that's obvious. Everything seems so real though. She thought. How did we get here? Scarlet asked, desperate for an answer. The Master observed her with a smile. Every time the girl became agitated and worried, it reminded him of when he first arrived in Zai. He saw himself in her, and from the moment he first saw her lying in the meadow, he knew there was a strange connection between them.
Come with me, Scarlet. I have much to show you,
the Master ordered. Scarlet didn't hesitate to follow the supposed Master as he descended a spiral staircase made of the same stone as the wall. He illuminated the path with the fire lamp held high. She looked up to see the portraits of the Masters hanging on the wall, and as she passed by them, she felt as though the paintings were watching her. One of the paintings was of Professor Aqua dressed in a yellowish-white gown. Her expression was stony, not reflecting any specific emotion. She almost looked like stone herself, but it seemed as though her eyes followed Scarlet as she walked by. Scarlet focused her gaze on Aqua's cheek in the portrait, which showed no trace of the purple scar she had seen in person, and she pondered the origin of that injury. Many theories swirled in her mind, but seeing that the master continued on without stopping, Scarlet cast aside her thoughts and quickened her pace to catch up with him. The master finally stopped at the bottom of the stairs, in front of an old wooden door that nearly covered an entire wall. The master extended his arm, opening the door without even touching it. Scarlet covered her face as she felt a gust of cold air on her face. But when she uncovered her eyes, they were dazzled by the sight of so many colorful lights. It was a dark room, but it was being illuminated by bubbles floating in the air. Within the bubbles, she could see certain photos and moments in motion. They entered the room, the door closing behind them as if an unknown presence awaited them. Scarlet couldn't find the right words to describe what she was seeing and feeling. She stood there, astonished, speechless. Those floating bubbles reflected moving images of unknown situations, objects, places. Scarlet watched, marveling at their beauty. A bubble passed by her with the image of a dark-haired person, and Scarlet lightly touched it with her index finger, expecting it to burst. But it allowed itself to be touched for a moment before continuing on its path. "What are these things? Bubbles?" Scarlet asked.
"More or less,"
the master replied, using his hand to create a current that caused the bubbles to move even faster.
"In some bubbles, you can see memories, in others, you can see what's happening in the present, and in some, you can simply see stories,"
he continued. There was a brief silence as both of them stared at the bubbles. Scarlet watched the reflected contents attentively, occasionally smiling. In one of the bubbles, there was a moving image of an elegantly dressed man with red hair, smiling as he read a book. Scarlet released the bubble, allowing it to float up to the ceiling like a balloon. The silence between the two was broken as a bubble passed by her with the image of a smiling woman. The woman seemed familiar to Scarlet, but she couldn't guess who she was. The master, upon seeing her reaction, placed his hand on Scarlet's shoulder and approached the bubble containing the photograph of the unknown woman.
"Do you want to know the truth about your mother? About where you are? Or would you rather not know anything and go back to your world?"
the master asked, gripping the bubble with both hands. Scarlet knew that, even if she returned to her world, nothing would be the same. She had lost her home, her mother, and she had no friends who could help her move forward. She had nothing left in her old home. It wasn't worth going back to a place where she wasn't accepted by society. She turned around and nodded slowly, wanting to know the truth once and for all. She felt she deserved it after so many years in the dark. For so many years, I knew nothing about her, you know? I knew nothing about my family, my father. Why did she have so many secrets? Scarlet asked, bombarding the master with her questions. The master raised his palm to silence her. Scarlet fell silent, seeing that the master commanded her to do so.
"Calm down, Scarlet. I can tell you everything I know, and in return, you tell me what you know. Does that sound fair?"
the master proposed. Scarlet nodded again. The master once again stirred the bubbles with his hands, seemingly searching for a specific one. Within seconds, a bubble with a red aura descended from above, distinct from the others. The master delicately grabbed it and turned to look Scarlet in the eyes.
"Let's start from the beginning.